want to spend a little bit of time kind of building up why I chose this title and why this research is important. So there is a lot of international interest right now in realigning agriculture to improve nutrition. There's almost a call to arms from the international development community to reshape agriculture, leverage agriculture, realize and unleash the power of agriculture to improve nutrition. And this has been met by the donor community as well as international aid organizations and governments. So you probably don't need me to tell you about USAID's Feed the Future initiative, initiatives like and competitions like Harvesting Nutrition, which aim to create a platform for development organizations to share their experiences integrating agriculture and nutrition. And the CG consortium has created a research program specifically focusing on agriculture for nutrition and health. So this is kind of a hot topic right now, as they say, and there's a lot of interest in this. But I think that before we start to look at the links between agriculture and nutrition and how we can leverage agriculture to improve nutrition, it's important for us to define what is improved nutrition and what determines it. So nutritional status is a reflection of how much food, not only how much food a person is eating, but also the composition of diet, as well as the body's absorption and utilization of those foods. So I think traditionally there's been a lot of focus on how much people are eating, getting food onto the plate, and not necessarily what's on the plate and the composition of that meal or diet. And that's particularly problematic because of micronutrient deficiencies. So this image will illustrate that. So here we're looking at 3 children who are the same age. The boy in the red shorts is properly nourished and doesn't have any nutritional deficiencies. The boy here in the blue shorts is wasted. So this is the striking kind of malnutrition that we see. Hungry children, children with very thin limbs. And that's really a reflection of how much, so this protein energy malnutrition. And this is a serious condition, but it only accounts for a small proportion of the burden of malnutrition. The large proportion, the lion's share of the burden of malnutrition on global health is really on this small child here in the green shorts. So this child is stunted, so he's just short for his age. And this is what people call invisible hunger or hidden hunger or invisible malnutrition. And this is really problematic in that, so this relates more to the composition of diet, so micronutrient deficiencies. And it's problematic in that after 2 years of age, this condition is irreversible. And it's related to poor cognitive function, increased morbidity and mortality of children under 5, as well as decreased productivity over life. So this is a serious and irreversible condition after 2 years of age that's related to the composition. So what are we eating? So this is really where integrating agriculture and nutrition has the potential to have an impact on a large number of people and preventing this condition stunting. So with that in mind, let's look at the different ways in which we can leverage agriculture to improve nutrition. So the pathway, the hope is that introducing an agricultural intervention somehow changes production, such as to directly change the variety of foods available at a household, or indirectly by increases in household income, changes in food prices, or changes in food availability in the market can change what is available at the household. That food then needs to be consumed. The nutrients of it need to be absorbed in order to have an impact on nutritional status. So those are the major links. But if we look at the actual empirical evidence on the impact of an intervention on nutritional status, the evidence is actually pretty slim. So systematic review after systematic review has shown that agricultural interventions have no significant impact on child nutrition, right? So these are a couple of the seminal pieces that have been released. So if you look at Birchie's systematic review in 2004, he says agricultural interventions increase food production, but not necessarily nutritional status. The data available show poor effect of these interventions on nutritional status. And the same is true of Ruel's piece in The Lancet, which is a high-impact journal in nutrition. But if you look at the way that interventions are being evaluated, what they're really looking at is exposure to an intervention and this very distal measure of nutritional status. So really, the way that the evidence is currently set up, our evidence base is treating all of these links inside of here as a black box. So effectively, if we find that an intervention has not had impact on nutritional status, there's really no saying why. So it could be that production has increases, variety increases at the household level, but children aren't eating it because perhaps women don't have time. Or it could be that all of these links are fulfilled, but that there's an underlying infection in that area, and so that the nutrients are not absorbed, and it's impossible to see an impact on nutritional status. So I think that the current state of the literature doesn't really tell us much about this link, because I think that the metrics right now that are used to assess this link are inappropriate. So there's a real need for us to unpack the links and look more closely at the pathway through which ag impacts nutrition. So back to our conceptual framework, and if we unpack this even in the most rudimentary and fundamental way, these are all of the necessary outcomes for leveraging an ag intervention and translating that into nutritional status. So there's a production aspect, a feeding aspect, and then an income use aspect. And if you look at these tasks, a lot of these are those that are traditionally attributed to women, right? We know that women are the primary caregivers of children, so feeding roles are typically the roles of women, of mothers. We know that women also contribute heavily to the labor in terms of agricultural production. And unpacking feeding even further, we can see that this is a pretty big burden to bear. So I think that what I'm trying to illustrate here is that there's a real need to understand the characteristics of women and the resources that women have if we want to understand how to leverage agriculture to improve nutrition. Because there are a lot of ways, notably the ones in this purple bubbles, that maternal characteristics and caregiving practices will determine whether an ag intervention is successful in impacting children's nutrition. So I think if we want to understand how to make agriculture work for nutrition, we all need to be asking ourselves the question, what about mom? So that's the question I'm asking for my dissertation research. And I'm doing that in the context of a home gardening intervention in Zambia. So to give you a little bit of background on that, I'm working with Concern Worldwide, which is an international aid NGO, and the International Food Policy Research Institute on their intervention called Realigning Agriculture to Improve Nutrition, not surprisingly. So the intervention is a home gardening one that's based in a rural subsistence setting in central Zambia. And the aims are to improve access to diverse and micronutrient-rich foods year-round. And ultimately, after a 5-year intervention period, to decrease child stunting. So this right here is a photo of nshima, which is a kind of maize meal that's very typical of Zambian diet, which is typically eaten with a relish. So here we have kale. It's typically a leafy green, and if it's available, some kind of protein. So in Mumbwa, where this intervention takes place, dietary diversity is very low, and diversity of production is also very low. And not surprisingly, there's a very high rate of stunting. So that's a little bit of background about RAIN. So the intervention itself uses women's groups as a platform. So they provide women's group with a small amount of seed for the production of vegetables, groundnut, and legumes, education on production practices, as well as a blanket kind of gender sensitization intervention. So they're talking to community leaders and doing spousal counseling in order to change dynamics related to labor in the household. So IFPRI is evaluating this study. There are 3 study arms. One that's receiving just agriculture, this intervention here, one that receives agriculture In addition to that, nutrition education and a control arm. So I'm going to take us back to this framework, just to map on this intervention to the framework. So our intervention is home gardening. They're hoping to see an increase in the variety of foods available and a change in nutritional status. So my research question relates to understanding maternal confidence that they're able to perform all of these tasks. So tasks related to production of food, which is what we're asking them to do, related to child feeding, which is a role that they typically take on, and the role of choosing and acquiring foods outside of those that are produced at the household. And I'm using the theoretical lens of self-efficacy because it's an important thing to consider in behavior change. So self-efficacy is really the confidence that you can do something. And behavior change theory tells us that people with higher self-efficacy or higher confidence are more likely to adopt a behavior and to maintain that behavior in the face of obstacles. So if we want to understand how to leverage this, to improve this, I think that's an important thing to consider. So I spent about 3 months in the field doing semi-structured qualitative interviews with about 29 women across all study arms, so those receiving intervention and those that were not, who had children in this critical window of 6 to 24 months of age, so just under 2. And the interviews were focused on understanding barriers and resources to IYCF, to infant and young child feeding, as well as agricultural production. So I'll present you with some preliminary findings on that. So looking at the domain specifically, again, of production, these are some of the barriers that women elicited. So access to land, time, as it relates to fetching water specifically, and access and availability of seed were the major barriers that women elicited in terms of adopting a home gardening intervention or producing food. So some of the quotes that came out from the interview. This is one woman who participated in the agriculture and nutrition group, but was forced to drop out because of the constraints. So it reads, I asked for some land, somewhere there, far, where there's a well so I can make my garden. Then they said no, unless I made my garden at the headman's place. And the headman said, my borehole is for fetching water, not for gardens. Whoever wants to make a garden should make a garden at their own place. So this really illustrates the maternal struggle in accessing land because she's not able to allocate any of the productive land of her household towards the production of vegetables or production of nutritious foods. It also reflects a little bit of the time constraint associated with fetching water and the unequal division of labor. Access and availability of seeds is also a problem in this area. So this woman, who is also receiving both the ag and nutrition intervention, receives quite a bit of support from her husband and would have liked to grow a certain amount of food or a certain type of food here, groundnut, but was unable to because the seed was not available. So now looking at barriers to use of household income or purchasing or acquiring foods outside of production. The major barriers that were elicited were control over income or acquiring outside income, a lack of social support, and also a lack of of diversity in the market. So I just have one quote here, and it's, I do worry about feeding the same food always, but then what do? We do it because we have no alternative. So this is in the context of a woman who has adequate knowledge about how to feed her child, but is unable to because she can't overcome barriers related to income, social support. So borrowing food was one of the main strategies that came up. So women with limited social networks were at a loss there. And looking at this last link here, self-efficacy or confidence in feeding, the major barriers are similar. A low social support, lack of social support from a spouse or from community members, time constraints, as well as limited knowledge. So if I tell him, my husband, to take the child to the clinic, he refuses. How can he agree to buy bananas or oranges for the baby then? And this really illustrates kind of a frustration, a lack of support at the household level. So women are not even, it sounds like this woman is not even intending to find a way to access that banana or that, or the orange. for her child. So it's important to kind of understand these cognitions when we're thinking about behavior change interventions, notably in this context. Time came up to be a huge issue, and this is related to the frequency of feedings. Women have a lot of constraints on their time and are not able to necessarily feed children at the times that they would like to. And that quote illustrates that. So knowledge also came out to be a barrier in retrospect. So women who were receiving the intervention and who had changed their behavior reflected on how they felt in the past. So we used to fear adding eggs to the baby's porridge, which is a recommended practice. So we can see that knowledge was also a barrier in that context. So putting it all together, what the analysis of the interviews has allowed me to do is identify domains and tasks that women need self-efficacy for in order to leverage homestead agriculture to improve nutrition. And from this, I've created a questionnaire that will be administered in a survey to create a scale in maternal self-efficacy. So it's really linking back to this framework to understand empirically, what does mom need to do all of these things, right? These are the three different categories. So a questionnaire has been created. The future steps for this are to administer the self-efficacy questionnaire to women in all three intervention arms, the two intervention arms and the control arm, and to look at the outcome of dietary diversity. So it'd be interesting to see in the future how self-efficacy predicts dietary diversity, and also whether the intervention has an effect on maternal self-efficacy. So is the intervention equipping the women with what they need in order to fulfill all their roles, and is their confidence in being able to fulfill all these roles predictive of dietary diversity? Does it matter? So that's the future plan. And I just want to come back to this framework again and point out that there's a lot more to look at on this pathway. So I'm particularly looking at the role of women in these specific domains, but there's a lot more to look at. I talked about nutrient absorption at the beginning of this presentation, but I did not look at that. But utilization of health services is a big thing that might be of importance here. So there are a lot of other important pieces of the pathway that I haven't presented, that I haven't looked at, but it's not to say that they're not there. So with that, I would like to thank Award for their support and for creating a platform really for us to discuss gender and the role that it plays in all of our research. The International Food Policy Research Institute and IGERT for their support on this, my advisor, David Pelletier, and our research group, and my committee members, and of course, the participants. So with that, I am happy to take your questions and comments.
What I'm trying to do here, and this award sponsored some initial research into this constitutional court ruling that Max mentioned. And I'm trying to take some of these overarching ideas and theories of land access, land disputes, land reform within Southeast Asia, trying to combine some of the village level data that I did with the AWARE award. And then when I go back in May, what I'll try to do more is incorporate some of these thoughts from forestry officials, from NGO workers that were working to get this court case brought before the Constitutional Court in Indonesia. So trying to integrate this idea of indigenous land rights and gender from kind of a couple of different levels within society. I guess my overall arching question, I haven't really gotten there yet. This is kind of the preliminary analysis, but to what degree has customary law been incorporated into statutory land laws within Southeast Asia and Indonesia? And then looking at what has happened, also what are the possibilities for customary law to be incorporated into recent court rulings impacting the land rights of those at society's margins? So the court ruling has happened, but there's really no framework that's been implemented yet to change these land rights. So there's a lot to look at about how the framework that's being set up for this. And there's a lot of room really for indigenous rights and gender rights to be incorporated. one of the questions that I think is important is to think about why Southeast Asia? What are some of the characteristics of this region that make it important to look at land disputes? And the first one is kind of an obvious one. It has high rates of biodiversity. Latin America and Southeast Asia have some of the highest biodiversity levels in the world, and for better or worse, these governments have been tasked with preserving that biodiversity, this idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and that happens to be usually at the global level and not so much at the local level. Combined with that also, you have high rates of conservation zones. The next slide, I'll kind of talk about some of the theories that people have about why there are such high rates of conservation zones in Southeast Asia, aside from high biodiversity. There are also high rates of forest-dependent communities within this region. There's a tendency when creating these conservation zones and protected areas to claim that they are empty spaces that are being turned into protected areas, but there are many forest-dependent communities across Southeast Asia that would probably dispute that. And so important for my research also is the strong tradition of customary law governing the use of forest resources in these regions. Within Indonesia, it's referred to as Adat, and other regions or other countries within the region, not all of them. So throughout the rest of the presentation, I'll refer to it as Adat. So when you hear that, I'm referring to customary law. In some places, you see customary law kind of being the overall law for communities and kind of at the expense of statutory national level laws. And then you have the other end of that where statutory law has basically just ignored customary law. And then you have some other cases where you see it being kind of a combination of them. This chart is basically, I put it together of some numbers within Southeast Asia. These are all the countries of Southeast Asia, total land area and population. PAs is protected areas, number of protected areas, amount of land in protected areas, and the percentage of land held in protected areas. Just for comparison, anything in the percentage of land areas in the 20s or above is considered a high percentage of land held in protected areas. United States has 27%. So, but you see the 18, 23, 13, 15, 18, 21. These are all fairly high levels of percent of land held in protected areas. The Indonesia is orange because that's the region or the country that I'm focusing on. I've highlighted total land area and population here because it shows the extremely high population density within Southeast Asia that's contributing to some of these land conflicts. And then the number of protected areas, highlighted some of the higher end of the numbers. And as I'll talk about, there's some reasons for these extremely high numbers. They don't always correlate to the percentage of land or the amount of land. They could be rather small, and there are some reasons for that happening in some of these countries. So protected areas in Southeast Asia. At its very best, one thinks about protected areas and why they are formed as the biological conservation in a region with high biodiversity. But there are some other historical events happening within Southeast Asia that you need to consider in why there might be some high rates of protected areas. So the first one being the colonial legacy of conservation training and education. All of the countries within Southeast Asia were colonized aside from Thailand, and Thailand itself implemented many of these same policies. So regardless if it was colonized or not, it had a very similar history in exchange for not being formally colonized. So all of these initial foresters, conservationists, national park officers were being trained in a manner that was consistent with conservation policy that was formed and developed within a European context, but was being implemented in a region that had a very different population density, a very different climate, a very different geography. And so it was not always the most appropriate to implement it within Southeast Asia, but yet there's been this colonial legacy of training and retraining people in a method that's not exactly appropriate. There's also ideas of modernity. So as these nation states switched from colonialism to independence, you had this prevailing idea of modern nation states have protected areas. So you have either intentionally or not intentionally, you have countries chasing modernity by creating these protected areas. Some of them just kind of went along with the rhetoric, but you also have a very intentional trajectory on this as well, that IMF and World Bank funding is very much tied to the number of protected areas. So you had states creating protected areas, even very small protected areas, in order to boost their numbers for funding. At its very worst, in probably the last 20 years or so, there's been more of this rhetoric of protected areas and conservation within as a global discourse. And so at its very worst, you see it as a form of land grabbing under the guise of conservation. Nation states can take land that technically belongs to these forest-dependent communities under the guise of using it for conservation zones, and it's very accepted and allowed in the international context. And little recourse for the communities to fight this back. And then at the same time, you can look at some of these zones that have been taken, this land that has been taken from forest communities, and you can look at the number of concessions that are being sold for logging and plantations. They're not actually being all put into protected areas. So, gender and land rights within Southeast Asia, obviously these are not applicable to all gender issues within Southeast Asia. But what I'm really looking at here is the focus on the way that inequality can compound. So you have increased marginalization for women, especially indigenous women. So issues such as restrictive inheritance for females. When they do inherited land becomes a family resource rather than being an insurance policy that the woman can claim if something were to go wrong. It becomes family land. Land titling schemes tend to have room to list one head of household. For example, in Vietnam, they noticed that this was an issue, and so they went ahead and rewrote the paperwork so that there was room for two heads of household, so they could include both males and females. But for the most part, the cultural aspects have not really changed in who they list. They still are listing the male as the head of the household. So that impacts gender and land rights as well. There's a lack of access to legal assistance, and this is women and gender issues, but it's also, it's a gender issue in that it impacts men as well. There's limited mobility for indigenous communities and knowledge of their rights or resources. And for my particular community, there's also, that I've been doing field work in, there's also limited participation in creating Adat land law, yet lives are very much governed by Adat, whether they have a say in creating it or not. This is the Constitutional Court ruling. It's 35/2012. It was passed in May of 2013 in Indonesia. So this is kind of my lens that I'm trying to look through for all of these issues, kind of some of the larger issues of land rights within Southeast Asia, but also this particular community. It was passed in May of 2013, and I arrived in Indonesia in May of 2013, so it was so new that there had been a whole lot of work to get it passed initially. There was not a whole lot of response from the government yet. There was a lot of response from NGOs and people and indigenous communities, so it'll be interesting to go back in May of this year and look at the difference in the framework that's been established. So what it was is, it changed the wording in the forestry law of 1999. The previous wording was Adat forest is a state forest situated in indigenous peoples' area. And the revised wording is Adat forest is a forest situated in indigenous peoples' area. So it took out one word out of this wording, or out of this sentence, but it changed and impacted ownership rights for over 40% of Indonesia's forests. And so they're kind of making this framework for communal land holdings with indigenous communities. There's been some issues with who gets recognized as indigenous within Southeast Asia and Indonesia. So, for example, Aman, who is the group that helped bring forth this court case, translated the ruling. And so they haven't translated as Indigenous Peoples Area, but the government would not translate it as that because there's a certain amount of rights that go with being thought of as indigenous. So there's some issues there about, at the very most, you can expect maybe 40% of Indonesia's forests to be impacted, but in a much more realistic sense, it's probably much lower. The particular park that I'm focused on is Gunung Halimun Salak National Park in Indonesia. It's 40,000 hectares of the highest biodiversity and forest cover left in Java. And this seems like it's significant, but most people that you talk to would have no idea it's down there. It's within a day trip of Jakarta, but it's relatively not very well known. Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch, so the Dutch originally created it as a protected forest in 1932. The issue with this is that the maps that they used to delineate the park boundaries were extremely contested because it basically ignored all settlements within the park boundaries. And so the government wound up jailing over 3,000 Swidden farmers before they agreed to rezone the park and redelineate. The problem with this is that right afterwards World War II started, and so the Dutch government was busy with war, and then afterwards the the Japanese came in, and then after that the Indonesian government was established. So the maps were never revisited like it was ruled that they were supposed to be. Then the Indonesian government turned it into a strict nature reserve in 1979 using those same maps that the Dutch government had promised to rezone. So obviously still very much contested. The maps don't show any of the settlements within the park boundaries. Then in 1992, it was turned into a national park. The communities at that time created an organization to basically to be their mouthpiece to the government and express their concerns to the government. It's since been disbanded, but at the time they did create an organization in order to express their concern. It's largely been a fence and fine approach to conservation. So despite the fact that the boundaries are so unclear, these conservationists still try to fence and fine the park boundaries, which is pretty much impossible to do. In 2005, it switched to a participatory co-management, but because there's a lack of funding for training for the national park officers, not much has really changed. The particular group that I'm working with is the Kasepuan Banten Kidul, and they claim settlement in the area since 1368. Their oral tradition has them as the descendants of the Penjajaran Bogor Kingdom. They're led by an Aba, or king, and this translates as father. Over on the left you see Aba Ugi. And this is a hereditary position that is always inherited by sons. And the ancestors will tell the current Aba who the next Aba should be out of his son, so it's not always necessarily the oldest son. So there are some offshoots of Kasepuans that are led by other Abas within the park boundaries because they are the descendants of older sons that didn't get. So Aba Ugi leads the largest of the community, but there are smaller ones that have just competing land claims because they are of the hereditary nature of the position. All Adat positions are hereditary, but the village government positions are all elected. They're semi-nomadic, so every 10 to 15 years they are in a particular village and then they will move to a new location. The problem with this is that the last time they moved was in 2000, and the village where they were located was noted or zoned as a adjacent village. And when they moved into a village that's located in the core zone. So this nomadic status is very difficult for the park officials. It makes absolute sense to the Adat community, but to the, I feel like we're in the forest. Okay, so zoning in Gunung Halimun Salak National Park is extremely complicated. Not only do you have the boundaries are ambiguous, but then you have all of these zoning. I did a run-through with someone of this presentation, and she suggested that I just tell you it's complicated. I tried to tell her all of the different zones, and she just got confused. So I'll just do them really quickly. There's village level zoning, there's official park forest zones, and then there's Adat land zones. I think it's important to note that enclave and encroachment villages are both located within the park boundaries, but enclave are not subjected to park administration, whereas encroachment villages are. And it has nothing to do with the amount of time that the villages have been within the park, which encroachment makes you think that it might. It actually has more to do with indigenous status. So encroachment villages tend to be small-scale rural farmers, whereas the enclave tend to go to the Kasapuan villages. There's official park forest zones. Enclave for the villages also, the Indonesian government has given enclave status to plantations and concessions within the national park. So they also get then on top of that zoned as special zones. Traditional religion, culture, and social zones. One is for like static culture, the other one is for living culture. It's just kind of a mess. It's really difficult for even the park officers. On top of that, you have Adat land zones, which for the Adat community, closed protected forest is about 60% of their land claims, entrusted is about 20%, and use is about 20%. The first two categories are communal land holdings, and the last one is individual use rights that they can buy and sell and trade amongst families in the community. So that gets confusing as well because these zones don't overlap. So a villager might go through and cut down a tree for firewood, like you see in this picture, and it would be in a use zone for the community, but it would be in a core zone for the national park. So there's some conflict there as well. Adat and gender is very important because there's very clearly defined gender roles. So for example, you see on the right, the males are getting ready to eat at a community Adat meeting. The males eat first, they get all the best food, and they all sit over here in the main area. The females are more over in like a side area or the kitchen. They eat what comes back into the kitchen, so there's some issues there. The guy in the picture here, his title is Pendukunan, and this is the highest level Adat position under Abah, and he's having some hereditary inheritance problems because he has 2 daughters and a stepson. So they're currently in conversation with the ancestors to see who will take over his role within his extended family. So, and he has a lot of say in forest use, land use, so he's a very important guy within Adat. Some examples of this, there's community work days. So every Friday, village members give their time and energy for Abah and his family. So on the left, you see males doing a road construction project. Rice is not allowed in the community to be milled by machinery. It must be milled by hand. So, and this is always a female task. So you see them over here. I did some preliminary work on some word association, and village members tend to associate words like fire, uncooked rice, gardens with females. And then they tend to associate things like forest, trees, firewood with males. So it's interesting looking at like the association that the community members have with gender and forest use. This is a different picture of a work party. This is some of the work parties are mixed gender, so this is a planting party. And it's interesting because in Southeast Asia in general, planting tends to be a female task, and this community, it's a mixed gender task. Also up here you see the village band. They make homemade bamboo instruments, and this is also mixed gender. The Imagade, it translates as big house. And it's really the structural center of the community as well as the spiritual center of the community. So people will refer to giving service to Imagade, and they don't mean this house particularly, but this idea of the community. And there's strict gender roles within this as well. All Adat meetings are held here. And so during Adat meetings, the men will meet here. There's a kitchen here, and the women will wait for the men to finish and then clean up the food. And, but they are not involved in creating this Adat. Adat officials, like I said, are all hereditary. So Sesepuh is another word for Abba. And these are all of the different Adat officials underneath him. And these are all of the, majority of them are male. There are 3 positions that are actually female. There's one that is she takes care of Abba's household. There's another one that's responsible for female circumcisions. And then there's a third that is responsible, she's basically the midwife for the community. And all 3 of these are female roles, but they are not involved in creating Adat or interpreting Adat. This goes to the males of the community, part of they call it the Balai Skolat, and this is them on the left, and you'll notice it's, like I said, it's all males. They're the ones that are responsible for interpreting and creating Adat. So going back to this Constitutional Court ruling, and looking at some of the details of this area, who were the winners and losers in 2012, and it's kind of like what are some of the aspects of land rights within the region that need to be taken into consideration. And one of those might be public access. If you're taking 40% of state land and turning it over to communal land holdings for indigenous communities, does the public lose out within Indonesia and also within the global aspect as well, access to biodiversity and preservation of biodiversity. Also, as I talked about with the encroachment villages and the small-scale rural farmers, under this court ruling, small-scale farmers that have no claim to indigeneity do not have a chance at regaining any of these land rights. So with this idea of land inclusion, you always have exclusion, so they're kind of the ones that are being excluded from these land rights, no matter how long they've been in the area. And also, like I said, this main framework has been for communal land rights. And so there's kind of this idea of what it means to be an indigenous community, and that generally includes this communal land rights. So what about indigenous communities that do not practice communal land rights, especially as you see happening with individual use rights in this third zone of the community? So I'm excited to go back and explore some of these issues. I included this picture because the CALS Aware Award, part of it was to help fund my son to accompany me on research. So here he is helping me create a map of the community. So thank you.